I'd now like to call Brian Smith up here, Professor Brian Smith. Brian needs no introduction to many of you, as he's spoken at 2 previous Ping seminars. He's a world-recognised authority on competitive strategy in pharmaceutical and medical technology markets. He understands the industry from first-hand experience, having spent 20 years working first as a research chemist and then in a series of marketing and strategy roles. He now divides his time in 3. Firstly, as a management scientist, he works at both SDA Bocconi in Milan and the University of Hertfordshire at Hatfield, who I'm glad to say we have a number of representatives here today, where he supervises a research group focused on understanding how the sector is adapting to a changing environment. As an author, Brian has written over 250 papers, articles and books on this subject, including his latest, The Future of Pharma. And yes, I've brought my copy along. In fact, John Zucker's and my copy along here, and it is a must-read for anyone who wants to find out about what's going on in the future of the sector. I can strongly recommend it. So Brian is actually working on his next piece of work, which is Darwin's medicine. And I'm not going to put you on the spot, Brian, but I'm hoping that's going to be out relatively soon so we can all get our teeth into that as well. And as a result of his thought-leading work in this area, he spends about a third of his time acting as an advisor to many of the world's largest pharma and medtech companies. In fact, from The Future of Pharma, you'll see that Brian has spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people at the top of the industry. So Brian brings a wealth of experience and knowledge and expertise, and it's an absolute pleasure to have Brian back with us again to give his thoughts. Thank you very much, Brian.
Well, on behalf of my publisher, thanks for the plug. I'm sure he'll send you a check later. And thanks to PLC for that summary. It's horrible. The conference organisers say, summarise your work in 40 minutes, and it's like, how do I cram it all down? And yet you guys did a great job at that. Thank you. As I sat and listened to the PwC presentation, strangely enough, the way an academic's mind works, the person who was going through my head was Mark Twain. Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and stuff. And Mark Twain famously said that history doesn't rhyme, history doesn't repeat itself, but history sometimes rhymes. And what we heard, if I'm not oversimplifying the PwC presentation, is we heard about lots of change. We heard about technological changes somebody mentioned cancer genetics, for instance, lots of other direct technological changes that are impacting on the industry. Indirect technical changes in the information technology environment and big data and all of this stuff. But also social changes. The peer pressures are the obvious ones that we hear about all the time, but also wider social changes like the death of deference towards the medical profession, demystification, the academics call it, or wealth distribution, the different wealth distribution and the emergence of middle classes and so on. And the reason it made me think of Mark Twain's comments about history rhymes is that with different examples, you could have given the same presentation in 1870. I'm not suggesting you're that old, okay, Joe? Okay. Because at that time, and you look at the history of the industry, and I choose 1870 because it was the beginning of a period that historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. It was the period that saw the emergence of what we would now call the modern pharmaceutical industry. And we were hit with technological and sociological changes. We were hit with, in the direct environment, there was the evolution of germ theory and so, for example, in organic chemistry. There were indirect technological changes, the evolution of telephones and telegrams and steam trains that allowed global businesses to be managed instead of local businesses. But there were huge social changes too. There was the emergence in Germany in particular of rudimentary social healthcare systems. But there was also changes in people moving from the countryside to the city, and we had similar epidemiological shifts, parallel epidemiological shifts to the great shift towards diabetes that we have now. So here's history rhyming. Okay? And the reason that's important is that what we should draw from what PwC have said and other people have said is that we're not going through a routine period of change. I started in the industry in in 1978. And ever since then, we've been talking about the collapse of the NHS. And those of you in the audience with some grey hairs, and there are one or two of you there, will remember we've always been talking about change in the industry. But this isn't an ordinary period of change. This is one of those spurts of punctuated equilibrium that you see every few generations. And that has important implications for how we manage. So how does that rhyme help us? Well, our industry evolved in that period, that second industrial revolution period, as a result of a whole series of selection pressures. And your firms will thrive or fail or whatever they'll do according to how well they recognise and understand and adapt to the selection pressures that are in the industry now. It's evolution. That's what it is. It's not like evolution. It is evolution. Okay. So when we hear history of rhyming, what PwC were doing today was reading poetry. Did you realise that? Okay. They were reading poetry, and it's your job not simply to listen and think, oh, that was a good presentation, that was quite interesting, but to understand the rhymes and the alliteration and the meter involved, to understand what it means for the future of the sector upon which your companies work. So when I do that, when I listen to all of that stuff, and I've read P.D. Sublu's very good work, but I also interview CEOs of most of the leading companies in the industry, and I have mountains and mountains and mountains of data back in my office that I look at. I hear six great shifts in the industry that you guys will need to adapt to. Okay. And I compare them, because of my great age, to the industry that I grew up in, when I used to stand at the bench and fiddle about with stuff. Okay. The industry I grew up in, compared to the industry we're seeing the great value shift. Okay. When I grew up, value meant a drug which performed better than another drug, had a better clinical outcome. Okay. And it was defined by doctors. Okay. That's not the world anymore. Okay. You all know now that value means health economic value. That's what you were saying, isn't it? Value means health economic value. And the doctors play some role in defining that, but not the major role. What that is a selection pressure. Any business model that does not respond to that great shift in the environment will die. Full stop. We're seeing a global shift. When I grew up in the industry, the pharmaceutical world was Europe this side of the Iron Curtain, Japan, a couple of former Commonwealth countries in the US. Okay? Many of you will recognise that. And of course, that's not the world now. There's interesting pie charts that PwC showed. We're living in a different world. Any business model that is not a global business model, and it means more than that, it means recognising the transnational segments that exist across borders. Any business model that doesn't recognise that shift will die. That's a selection pressure. We're seeing something that will be called in Darwin's medicine the systemic shift. Okay, when I grew up, the science that we based what our drugs on was based on what was happening inside an organ. And it was based on relatively limited amounts of data, and we treat each organ as a little separate little entity. Okay? That's not the way the world's going. With systems biology and systemic medicine, and genomics and proteomics and epigenetics and everything else, it's a complete paradigm shift. In the true sense of the word, what everybody misuses the term paradigm shift now, don't they? But what Kuhn originally meant when he said paradigm shift, that's what we're seeing. Okay? And any business model which doesn't use that new knowledge will die. That's a selection pressure. We're also seeing a huge, what in the book I call it the consumerist shift. The industry I grew up in, the people who made the decisions were the doctors. My mother would go along to a doctor, say, "This is wrong with me, doctor." He'd pat her nicely on the head and she'd go out with a prescription. That's not what happens when my wife goes to the doctor. When my wife goes to the doctor, she beats him to a pulp with a roll of Google printout until she prescribes what she demands. And many of you will do the same, I'm sure. Okay? With wearable technology and medical technology, look what Theranon, for example, are doing in the States right now. Going into Walmart, stick your finger in a machine, take a blood prick and get your basic panel of blood tests done there. We're entering into a consumerized world, just as it was 150 years ago. The medical world, the pharmaceutical market will be a consumerized one. It's a selection pressure. Any business model which does not respond in some way to that selection pressure will die. We're seeing the great information shift. The world that I grew up in, The industry's always dealt with data, always been data rich compared to other industries. But the data we've collected has been relatively limited. It's been in packets, it's been separated, it's been siloed, and we've not really had enough of it to do really significant things with. And what we're capable of doing now with big data, not just in drug development, but in consumer behavior and in operations and supply chain, in all parts of the classic Porter's value chain, what we're able to do with data now, because it's pervasive and persistent and we get it from everywhere, is going to be huge, enormous. And it's a selection pressure. And any industry which is not adapting to the information shift will die. And then finally, and what I find most interesting, although it's quite an old concept, is we're seeing the emergence of what we might call the trimorphic shift. The industry I grew up in, if you looked at a generic company, and if you looked at a research-based company, and if you looked at a little specialized company that might tailor its activities towards the customer, although they were different business models, they weren't very different. The cost base was relatively similar. The technology was relatively similar. The way of doing things was relatively similar. But we're heading to a world which is completely different from that. In future, we'll have generic companies that will make products that are so cheap, they're cheaper than mortar. We're seeing levels of technology in companies like Roche, for example, that are so different from what are done in other parts of the industry, they're almost not counted as the same industry anymore. And with what we're able to do with wearable technology and constant blood monitoring and sticking your iPhone up your bottom to test yourself, we're seeing an ability to tailor medicine to individuals, not just in genomics and not just stratification of medicines, but tailor treatment regimes in a way that will make the old model of everybody with this disease gets this pill, will make that look ridiculous and arcane and historical artifact. So we're seeing this three-way polarization of business models. So what will these lead to? Well, this is important. We talked a lot today about business model change. Okay? And of course, business model will change. But the interesting about evolution is it doesn't lead to a species changing into another species. Okay? If you go back enough great-great-grandfathers of the people in this room, okay, we find an early primate. Okay? But if we work forward from that primate, we don't just find humans. We find monkeys and apes and shrews and all. And if we go far enough back, we find even more species. In other words, not only will business models develop and evolve, but they will fragment, okay, into many, many different types of business models. And interestingly, those business models won't simply be a company is a business model. They'll be what in my research we call holobionts. There'll be clusters of organizations that are constantly shifting and fragmenting, that are interconnecting with each other, holobionts, in the same way that a lichen or a coral reef is a holobiont. Okay? Multiple entities working together. So let me close with what lessons. And, the ancient Greeks in the art of rhetoric always used to talk about this rule of threes. You keep it to three, so I'm going to try and keep it at three. First lesson, appreciate that you're living in a period where it's a once every few generations leap forward in the evolution of our industry. It's a huge period of change. So don't fiddle with your business model. Don't worry about, tweaking this bit of the product or tweaking with that. Think big, think strategically. Realize that the world of 10 years' time is going to be nothing like the world of 10 years past. And if you carry on improving your business by fiddling with the detail, you won't evolve fast enough. The second lesson I would say is don't straddle. You're going to see this great polarization into companies that are fantastic technologically, but relatively very expensive. And companies that are incredibly efficient and cheap, but relatively backward technologically. And companies that are able to tailor their approaches to customers or patients in an incredibly tailored, individualistic way, but will be relatively inefficient and relatively technologically low-tech. You'll see this trimorphic shift. And as Porter famously said in 1980, companies that straddle between those will fall over, they'll die. Okay, it'll be neither one thing, it'll be neither fish nor fowl. Okay? If you look at the great diversity of biological systems, like in the rainforest, for instance, you know, the reason that the sloth and the piranha and the parrot are so different from each other in the Amazonian rainforest is because they're superbly adapted for their environment. And the reason, and that's why there are no animals that are a bit like a parrot and a piranha and a sloth put together. Okay? And that's the challenge. And finally, a note about timescale. I talked about punctuated equilibrium, because evolution doesn't go slowly, it goes in spurts. Okay? And by the time you are certain what the future is, by the time you can put together an absolutely rock-solid, no-risk business case, you will be dead. Okay? So don't dally. Okay? Pick your new strategy, pick your new business model, and get on with it. Thank you very much.